Um, so fast, oh, okay, so we'll start with the Mangalacharan. Om Majnani Timrandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namah Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Sri Guru Sri Udapadakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajadam Sagana Raghunathan Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parjana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padhan Sagana Lalita Sri Vishakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpati Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanuste Devi Pranamami Hari Pre Pancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Okay, so we are in chapter 10 of the first canto. Today will be verse number 5. So this chapter is regarding Lord Krishna's departure to Dwarka after the war, and there are descriptions regarding how Krishna himself was satisfied after installing Yudhishthira as the king of Hastinapur. And this chapter actually starts with the query from Shaunaka Rishi, when he actually asked how Yudhishthira was able to rule. And these are the descriptions, like which describe how it was like during Yudhishthira's reign. So this fifth verse, will start by reciting the verse. Nadya Samudra Giraya Savanaspati Viruda Palantyo Shadya Salva Kamam Anvrututasya Vai Nadya Samudra Giraya Savanaspati Viruda Palantyo Shadya Salva Kamam Anvrututasya Vai Nadya Samudra Giraya Savanaspati Viruddha Palantyo Shadya Salva Kamam Anvrututasya Vai. So anyone want to try recite the verse?
Hare Krishna, sir. I try.
Okay.
Nadya Samudra Giraya Sabanaspati Viruhat Palanti Osaya Sarva Kama Anurut Tasyave.
Good, Mataji. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next. Next, Prabhu. Let's go through. Okay, anyone else? Okay, so we'll proceed with the synonyms. Nadya Samudra Giraya Savanaspati Viruddha Palantyo Sadya Sarva Kama Manrututashtavai. Nadya, rivers, Samudra, oceans, Giraya, hills and mountains, Savanaspati, vegetables, Viruddha, creepers, Palanti, active, Osadya, drugs, Sarva, all, Kamam, necessities, Anvritu, seasonal, Tasya, for the king, by certainly. Translation: the rivers, oceans, hills, mountains, forests, creepers, and active drugs. In every
Sir,
season.
the screen couldn't show the purpose.
Okay. The rivers, oceans, hills, mountains, forests, creepers, and active drugs in every season pay their tax quota to the king in profusion. So actually, last week we saw in the fourth verse how prosperous was the agricultural sector under the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira. We also saw descriptions regarding how the cows had their milk bags full. So in the purport last week, the fourth verse, it was described regarding how prosperous was the agrarian society during those days in Dwapara Yuga. Because nowadays in Kali Yuga, whenever we talk about farmers, we only get the picture of someone who is poverty-stricken. But in the previous Yugas, people were very prosperous simply by engaging in agricultural activities. And even in many of Prabhupada's books, not just in Gita and Bhagavatam, even in the small books, Prabhupada has even highlighted how any person can be can live prosperously simply by having a land and some cows. Because at the end of the day, we all need food to survive. So we cannot really eat any of the manufactured devices. So that's how that was regarding how prosperous the population was during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira, simply by engaging in agriculture. But the important thing to be noted is that when the vast section of the population is engaged in agriculture, it actually depends a lot on the Supreme Lord's mercy, because we need sufficient amount of rainfall, and the weather should be ideal, because too less rain is also a problem, and too much rain will prove to be even a bigger disaster, especially when the crops are ready for harvest. When if floods happen in during those times, then still the crops will get destroyed. So a lot of factors when it comes to agriculture, especially not just in agriculture, actually in everything that we do, we need the Supreme Lord's mercy to succeed. So in agriculture especially, apart from the weather conditions, especially regarding the rainfall, we also saw how important it was to conduct sacrifices to get the blessings of the demigods, which are also sanctioned by Krishna himself. So apart from that, there are also many other natural resources which also play a very important role when it comes to the agricultural sector, just like the rivers, hills and mountains. Apart from that, even for when we talk about drugs, especially for to manufacture medicines, all these herbs were also found in many of the hills. So all these natural resources are created by the Supreme Lord. That too through his inferior material energy. So whatever great discoveries or inventions that we all claim to that we all brag about, whatever raw materials or ingredients required for those inventions all come from natural resources. So it is important to acknowledge the supreme proprietor who is the owner who gave us all these resources. So in this verse, it is described how when the ruler, as we know, during the reign of Yudhishthira, the entire Bharatavarsha was under the kingdom of Hastinapur. So he was the ruler of the entire Bharatavarsha. So he himself was favored by the Supreme Lord. And therefore, since all these natural resources come from the Supreme Lord's creation, even they were in harmony during those times, unlike what we are seeing nowadays. So this verse is regarding that. And apart from Maharaj Yudhishthira, even during the reign of Maharaj Parikshit, he actually even expanded the kingdom much further to cover the entire Jambudvipa. So beyond Bharatavarsha itself, apart from Bharatavarsha, all other regions, whether it's Jambudvipa or even beyond the Jambudvipa, like the other Saptadvipas, all these regions are known as Bhauma Swargas. So during those days, unlike us, the Kali Jivas, the exalted devotees of the Supreme Lord, like Yudhishthira, they all had access to the entire Bhumandal, to the extent where they were able to even rule such vast tracts of land. But due to the degradation of Kali Yuga, so nowadays we see so many different nations, even within Bharatakanta, the planet Earth where we are living in. So even within Bharatakanta, there are so many nations, because we as Kali Jivas, we simply don't have the ability to rule such vast portions of the Bhumandal, and therefore everything has been degraded during this age. But it was the exact opposite during Dwapara Yuga and the previous Yugas. Now the purport: since Maharaj Yudhishthira was under the protection of the Ajita, the infallible Lord. So Ajita here means means negation. Jita, Jit means victory. So Ajita is the one who cannot be conquered. He was under the protection of Ajita, the infallible Lord, as above mentioned. The properties of the Lord, namely the rivers, oceans, hills, forests, etc., were all pleased, and they used to supply their respective quota of taxes to the king. So this is especially very important when it comes to the agrarian society, when the vast population is engaged in agriculture. So they need all these resources to survive. And since the ruler of the kingdom was someone who was blessed by the Supreme Lord, so even all the creations of the Supreme Lord were also in harmony during his rule. The secret to success is to take refuge under the protection of the Supreme Lord. Without his sanction, nothing can be possible. To make economic development by our own endeavors on the strength of tools and machinery is not all. The sanction of the Supreme Lord must be there. Otherwise, despite all instrumental arrangements, everything will be unsuccessful. So, compared to the so-called modern democratic setup, we can clearly see that during Dwapara Yuga or even the previous yugas, even in Treta Yuga, the most commonly known or the most prominent kingdom is that of Ayodhya. So much has been said about Ram Raja during Treta Yuga. So, in all the previous yugas, despite the so-called autocratic rule during those yugas, the situation was such that the ruler was someone who was favored by the Lord, like Maharaj Yudhishthira, or it was the Supreme Lord himself, just like Lord Rama. Even in Dwapara Yuga, Krishna himself was the ruler of the kingdom of Dwarka. And in Hastinapur, when the demoniac people like the Kauravas were ruling, still the Supreme Lord ensured that a righteous king like Yudhishthira could take over. So the entire setup was such that even the so-called autocratic ruler was someone who was especially favored by the Lord, because a person like Maharaj Yudhishthira and even Maharaj Parikshit, they were all exalted devotees of the Supreme Lord. And therefore, the entire population was living prosperously under those so-called autocratic rulers. Nowadays, even if we utter such terms like autocracy, a lot of half-baked intellectuals will be jumping in joy just to mock these parts of our scriptures. But it cannot be denied that during those yugas, the population that was living under these autocratic rulers or monarchies, they were much happier compared to the so-called democratic system that we have now. Because here it is described that all the natural resources like the rivers, oceans, hills, they all paid their tax quotas to the ruler of Hastinapur. But nowadays, despite the fact that we ourselves, we are the ones who elect our governments, we claim to have a democratic system, a modern system, where it is said that the system is by the people, for the people, and all that. But whenever it comes to taxation, we all have a problem. We say that the so-called democratic system is extremely progressive because we get to choose the ones who are going to rule us. But still, whenever there are certain rules made, especially when it comes to taxation, we ourselves who always sing the glory of this democratic system, we are the ones who also get very agitated and upset when we think about all these taxes that are collected, because the taxes which are collected should actually be utilized for the welfare of the people. But in many nations all over the world, that's hardly the case. And when it goes beyond a certain extent, we can see what happens. Like even the extremely great regimes which have been ruling for decades, even they have to even they are toppled when there is excessive taxation. But in this verse, it is explained that even the natural resources, they were giving their share to ensure that the kingdom of Maharaj Yudhishthira prospered. This is simply because since Maharaj Yudhishthira was a pure devotee of the Supreme Lord, he was never obsessed about his own personal sense gratification. None of the Pandavas were like that. They have always, throughout their entire life, they have seen so many trials and tribulations, and it was only towards the end of their life that they actually got to rule in Hastinapur. And even when, even after Krishna's departure from this material world, even they themselves, they did not want to live like a royalty. So they handed over the kingdom to Parikshit. So such was their devotion towards the Supreme Lord. They were never obsessed with all these material opulence. But what we are seeing nowadays is the exact opposite. The so-called democratically elected rulers, they are hell-bent on doing whatever it takes to accumulate material wealth simply for their personal sense gratification, despite the fact that they give all sorts of promises during the election campaign period. So that is the difference between the previous yugas and this degraded age of Kali Yuga. It is also mentioned in the purport that the secret to success is to take refuge under the protection of the Supreme Lord. Without his sanction, nothing can be possible. In Gita 5.29, Krishna says, Bhoktaram yakina tapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suridam sarvabhutanam nyatmamam shantim richati. Krishna is the supreme enjoyer of all sacrifices. Sarvaloka maheshwaram, he is the supreme controller of all the demigods and planets. Suridam sarvabhutanam, he is the supreme well-wisher of all living entities. Nyatmamam shantim richati. Anyone who understands this will attain peace. So in Gita 5.29, Krishna says that he is the supreme controller. And in Brahma Samhita 5.1, it is also stated, Ishvara Parama Krishna, Sachidananda Vigraha, Anadiradi Govinda, Sarva Karana Karanam. So apart from what Krishna himself says in the Gita, all other scriptures also substantiate what he says, that he is the supreme controller. So nothing is possible without his sanction. So the secret to success is to take refuge under the protection of the Supreme Lord. But before knowing how to attain success, it is also important for us to clearly understand about what is success. In this material world, success is measured based on many different factors, but especially we as devotees, we should know that none of it matters, because whatever is related to material life is ultimately going to be will prove to be meaningless. We as devotees, we must know this fact, and therefore it is very important to first understand what is success. Now, since we have got this human form of life, so how do we define success? The best definition for success for someone who has got this human form of life is to get liberated from this material bondage and return to the Lord's supreme abode, to attain his eternal association, to regain our eternal constitutional position as the servants of Krishna in his supreme abode. That would be the best definition of success for us who have got this human form of life. So knowing this meaning of success itself is a huge success, because unless we know this, we can never progress in anything we do. We are simply going to be trapped in this endless cycle of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi without knowing this. We should realize that we have got this human form of life, so we must realize the true meaning of success for us, since we have got this precious form of life. Especially in the purport for Gita 7.16, Prabhupada himself has explained in the last paragraph. At one point, Prabhupada mentions that material remuneration has nothing to do with spiritual improvement. As we know in Gita 7.16, it talks about the 4 types of people who surrender to Krishna. In 7.15, Krishna talks about the Duskritis, the 4 types of people who do not surrender to him. Krishna himself acknowledges that there are these types of people who do not surrender to him. And in 7.16, he talks about the 4 types of people who surrender to him. Chaturjuda Padantimam Jana Sukirtana Arjuna Artho Jignasu Ratati Jnani Cha Bharatarshabha. So Krishna mentions about the types of Sukirtis, like the one who is in distress, the one who is going after material wealth, the one who is inquisitive, and the Jnani. Then in the subsequent verses, like 7.17 and 18, Krishna goes on to add that though all 4 of these types of people are very dear to me, Krishna is saying that all the 4 types of people, the 4 types of Sukirtis who surrender to him are very dear to him, but he specially prefers the Jnani, because the Jnani is someone who knows for sure why he should surrender to Krishna. Like someone who is in distress or someone who is after material wealth, such people, despite the fact that they are willing to surrender to Krishna, they often pray to Krishna for very temporary and material benefits, which is not very intelligent. Because when we talk about the material needs and material benefits, it's not just for us. Even cats and dogs, they also have their bread and butter issues. So if we are going to simply surrender to Krishna for such trivial reasons, then there's no difference between us and the animals, because it's going to be like we are also going to be more intensely engaged in the business of eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. So that is not it's not, though Krishna appreciates the fact that we are willing to surrender to him, but surrendering to him just because we are in distress or just because we want to accumulate material wealth, that is not the wisest thing to do. And therefore, even for the person who is inquisitive, ultimately that person can become a Jnani. So when the person becomes a Jnani, so such a person will realize that material remuneration has nothing to do with spiritual improvement. At that point, the person realizes that anything that is related to this material life should not be confused with devotional service, because whatever we do for our material life in this life, it's not going to benefit us spiritually. Only our devotional service and our intense sadhana will prove to be beneficial, despite the fact that, of course, we have to take care of our material affairs, but still we still can do everything with a spiritual mindset, simply by following Krishna's instructions in the Gita. Like Krishna tells Arjuna in 8.7, Tasmat Sarve Sukaleshu, Ma Manusmara Yudhyacha, Maya Arpita Manobutir, Mami Ishasya Samsya. So he's saying that you do your duty of fighting while thinking of me, remember me always, and you will come to me. So in many such verses, Krishna says that we can still be engaged in our material duties and still we can remember Krishna, and by doing so, we will still be engaged in devotional service. Whatever material duties that we do can actually be spiritualized simply by thinking of Krishna, by engaging in Krishna consciousness. But the most important thing to be noted here is that all these must be done with the spiritual mindset, where we only aim to attain the eternal association of Krishna in his supreme abode, and not for all these temporary material benefits. So the jnani knows this for sure, and that's why Krishna specifically mentions that the jnani is the dearmost to him out of all the four types of sukirtis. Then to make economic development by our own endeavors on the strength of tools and machinery is not all. The sanction of the Supreme Lord must be there. Otherwise, despite all instrumental arrangements, everything will be unsuccessful. The ultimate cause of success is the Deva, the Supreme. So in relation to this, we also know that we as conditioned living entities, we are always fallible due to the four defects, like making mistakes, the propensity for cheating, being in illusion, so due to all these and also due to our imperfect senses, due to all these defects, we are always unable to come up with whatever we invent or whatever we do. There will always be imperfections due to our own inherent abilities, and therefore the mercy of the Supreme Lord is especially important to make it successful. This is despite the fact that all the so-called rationalists and atheists, they try to deny the existence of God, but what they do is that whenever they come up with imperfect creations or so-called discoveries, then they tend to cover up by saying that when they realize that their so-called discovery is actually wrong or inaccurate discovery, then they tend to cover up by saying that no, this is a new discovery. So that's how they cover up all their defects. But the fact remains that we can never escape from all these fallibilities. And that's why even in Gita 18.14, Krishna also says that there are 5 factors which influence the outcome of our actions. Adhishtanam tatakarta, karanam cha pratakvidam, vividasta pratakshestat, devam saivalta panjamam. The place of action, the body, the performer, the various senses, the many different kinds of endeavor, and ultimately the super soul. These are the 5 factors of action. So apart from our own inherent abilities, ultimately the outcome is decided by Krishna himself. Also in Gita 2.47, Krishna says, Karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, ma karma phala heturvur, ma te sangosto karmani. Krishna also says that we have the right to perform our actions, but we are not entitled to the fruits of action. There are some half-baked intellectuals who also mock this verse by saying that Oh, so does that mean that if you work for one entire month, so does that mean that you don't have to collect your salary? So a lot of half-baked intellectuals tend to mock this by saying such things, but what this actually means is that the ultimate outcome of our actions is still dependent on Krishna, because we know that we have so many imperfections. We have imperfect senses, and we always have this inherent uh, defect of making mistakes. So, despite all these imperfections, if we are able to actually do something successfully, that is still due to the mercy of Krishna. We must understand that we are so uh, fallible, and still, if we are able to actually do something successfully, that is only due to the mercy of Krishna. So that's how we should understand this, not like what those half-baked intellectuals say. So in the verse from Gita, in 18.14, Krishna mentions that ultimately the super soul, means the fifth factor which influences the outcome of an action, is the super soul. So it is mentioned that the super soul especially influences the outcomes of actions, because the super soul who is seated within our hearts is our uh, friend. Like as mentioned earlier in Gita 5.9, Krishna says that he is the supreme well-wisher of all living entities. So he is able to be the supreme well-wisher of all living entities. Like we know that there are 84 lakh 84 lakh different kinds of material bodies, and there are innumerable living entities in every universe. For each universe, there's one Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, and Shirudakashayi Vishnu is seated there in the hearts of all living entities within each and every single universe itself. And we also know that there are many other innumerable universes that emanate from the bodily pores of Mahavishnu. So, how is Krishna able to serve as the supreme well-wisher? Because he is seated in our hearts as the super soul. So, he knows our desires, and even when we are trying to endeavor to achieve something, despite all our imperfections, he is always there to help us. So we must understand that whatever that we are trying to achieve, we are able to do it successfully despite all our imperfections due to the mercy of Krishna. So it is extremely foolish to turn around and blame Krishna whenever something goes wrong, because he is always very merciful to make things work for us despite all our imperfections. So that's why we should follow the footsteps of the great devotees. Neither Maharaj Yudhishthira or Maharaj Parikshit, they are not merely known as great kings, but they are known to be great devotees because they were following the footsteps of the Supreme Lord. They always acted as responsible agents of the Supreme Lord. So as stated in the purport, the ultimate cause of success is the Deva, the Supreme. Kings like Maharaj Yudhishthira knew perfectly well that the king is the agent of the Supreme Lord to look after the welfare of the mass of people. Actually, the state belongs to the Supreme Lord, not just the state, the entire creation. Everything that exists belongs to the Supreme Lord. So it is extremely foolish of all these so-called modern day rulers who are trying to think that they can conquer the whole world. So we also know from Bhagavatam itself what happens to such demoniac rulers who have such demoniac propensities, just like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana. In this modern age, especially this age of Kali, there are so many Hiranyakashipus and Ravanas who are thinking that they can rule the entire world. But even when we look at the history of Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, both of them, they got their boons from Brahma and Shiva, respectively. Okay, but they themselves were so foolish to because they failed to realize that even Brahma and Shiva, who gave them those boons, they themselves, Brahma and Shiva themselves, were supreme devotees of the Supreme Lord. Even Brahma and Shiva were surrendered to lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. But still, these fools like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, they were unable to see that. And that's why they had to meet their end. And what we are seeing in Kali Yuga is very similar to that. But the modern day Hiranyakashipus and Ravanas are much more foolish than them. This is when we look at the case of Maharaj Yudhishthira, it is the exact opposite. Demoniac kings like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana were willing to do anything for their personal sense gratification. They wanted to rule the entire world. They actually wanted to replace the Supreme Lord, and therefore they were obsessed with their demoniac desires. But a person like Maharaj Yudhishthira, he was the exact opposite. He was the complete antithesis to those demoniac kings. Because in the case of Yudhishthira, he was extremely devastated after seeing so many lives that were lost after the war, and he was unable to accept that it all happened for his sake. He was actually feeling guilty to take over after the war, after seeing so many lives lost. So he was never a power-hungry king, and that's why he was especially favored by the Supreme Lord. Not just by the Supreme Lord, even his brothers were always very supportive of him, come hell or high water. Even when they were undergoing so many hardships during their exile, all his brothers, they were very supportive of him. And especially when they had to prepare for the war, all the brothers were very cooperative. They knew that it was that even after the war, only Maharaj Yudhishthira is going to be installed as the king, and still all the other younger brothers were willing to support him. So that is the difference between the devotee of the Lord, because when the devotee has the mercy of the Supreme Lord, then he has everything. Unlike the demoniac kings like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, and also the modern day Hiranyakashipus and Ravanas. So since the Supreme Lord himself was very satisfied with Maharaj Yudhishthira, who was a great devotee, so all the natural resources created by the Supreme Lord, they also provided their share to the king. The rivers, oceans, forests, hills, drugs, etc. are not creations of man. They are all creations of the Supreme Lord. And the living being is allowed to make use of the property of the Lord for the service of the Lord. So Maharaj Yudhishthira was always aware of the fact that despite being him being installed as the king, he was always humble enough to acknowledge acknowledge the fact that he is only acting as a representative of the Supreme Lord. So he was never obsessed with his personal agenda. He was, for him, the Supreme Lord's agenda was always of utmost importance to him. However, this is the exact opposite is happening nowadays in Kali Yuga. The so-called modern day leaders who are actually the so-called democratically elected leaders who are there also because of us. They want to simply project their glory at all costs. Whenever a new ruler or prime minister takes over, there's always this amusing competition to see who is able to construct more skyscrapers or the next tallest building in the world. In the end, they destroy all these beautiful natural resources like forests, hills, and mountains, only to build concrete jungles. As a result, we find that these naturally occurring jungles, which are creations of the Supreme Lord, they tend to become very rare, and they appear to be more civilized compared to the concrete jungles where we, the supreme creations of the Supreme Lord, human beings live in. We live in the concrete jungles, and it has come to a point where the animals that live in the natural jungles, they are actually more civilized than us nowadays in Kali Yuga. So in Kali Yuga, what happens is that instead of using the Supreme Lord's properties, especially the national resources, now it's all about gross misuse and abuse of the resources. Driven by greed, human beings who consist of predominantly the Shudra population in this Kali Yuga, they are willing to do anything to destroy these beautiful natural properties of the Supreme Lord without any compassion. Today's slogan is that everything is for the people, and therefore the government is for the people and by the people. But to produce a new species of humanity at the present moment on the basis of God consciousness and perfection of human life, the ideology of godly communism, the world has to again follow in the footsteps of kings like Maharaj Yudhishthira or Parikshit. There is enough of everything by the will of the Lord, and we can make proper use of things to live comfortably without enmity between man and man, or man and animal, or man and nature. This is actually the most important portion of this verse. It is mentioned here how we can restore harmony between man and man, man and animal, and man and nature, because that is what is lacking nowadays in Kali Yuga. First of all, Kali Yuga is known as the age of quarrel and hypocrisy. When we say quarrel, whether it is between man and man, even between man and man, always there are quarrels, even for the most trivial reasons. And we don't have to say about man and animal or man and nature. We cannot even live peacefully with our next door neighbors, or even with neighboring nations. So we also tend to destroy the natural habitats of animals, and we are also destroying all the natural resources created by the Supreme Lord. So all these are happening because of the degradation of in Kali Yuga, and the reason for this is that we are unable to understand about the supreme proprietorship. I've shared this link to Ishopanishad in the chat window, so you can open this Ishopanishad in Vedabase, or you can even refer to the book if you have it. So in Ishopanishad, there are 3 important mantras, including the invocation mantra. So the first mantra, the invocation mantra, Om Purnamata Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate, Purnasya Purnamadaya, Purnam Eva Vashishyate. The personality of Godhead is perfect and complete, and because he is completely perfect, all emanations from him, such as this phenomenal world, are perfectly equipped as complete wholes. Whatever is produced of the complete whole is also complete in itself, because he is the complete whole. Even though so many complete units emanate from him, he remains the complete balance. This is the invocation mantra in Ishopanishad. It can be found in Vedabase or even in the book if you have it. So, in the invocation mantra, it is mentioned about how the Supreme Lord is the complete whole. Even though many emanations emerge from him, he remains the complete balance. On one hand, this can be understood as how even all the living entities that are part and parcels of the Supreme Lord, how they all emanate from him. That is one aspect of it. And another aspect is regarding the Bhagavan realization itself. Like we know that there are 3 levels of Bhagavan realization, the 3 features, beginning from the impersonal Brahman feature, followed by the Paramatma realization and Bhagavan realization. In these 3 levels of realization, we also know that there are the 3 features associated with these 3 levels. Only in Bhagavan realization, we get to know the complete realization of the complete Bhagavan feature. Because in the impersonal Brahman realization, we only realize the Sat feature. Out of Satchidananda Vigraha, we only realize the Sat feature. Then in the second Paramatma realization, we realize the Sat and Chit features. Only in Bhagavan realization, we understand the Sat, Chit, Ananda features of the Supreme Lord. So it is also important to attain this Bhagavan realization to understand the complete whole in the complete realization. So we also know that there are 84 lakh species of material bodies to accommodate all the conditioned souls. So even all these creations, whether it is the spiritual or material, all these emanate from the energies of the Supreme Lord. So this itself must be understood to understand the concept of supreme proprietorship. All the problems that we are seeing nowadays is because of our tendency. It actually it is deeply rooted in our tendencies, because we are all conditioned living entities trapped in this material world. So we are here simply because we have this tendency to be Ishvara and Purusha. However, when we develop too much demoniac qualities within ourselves, it gets aggravated to such levels where we tend to be just like Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, who wanted to actually replace the Supreme Lord. So those who fail to understand this supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Controller, they are the ones who make life miserable, even not just for others, but also for themselves in this Kali Yuga. So first, in the invocation mantra, it is stated regarding how the Supreme Lord is the complete whole of everything, out of which all other emanations emerge. If we ourselves are so minute particles that emanate from the Supreme Lord, how can we even think about replacing him or taking over his kingdom? When we ourselves are such minute particles of the complete whole, how can we even unknowingly develop such foolish desires? But history has shown us that such demoniac beings did exist, and how the Supreme Lord dealt with them so easily. Next, after the invocation mantra, is the first mantra of Isha Upanishad. Ishavashyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bunjita magrada kasya svidhanam. Everything, animate or inanimate, that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota, and one should not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. So, in relation to the invocation mantra itself, if we ourselves are minute particles that emanated from the Supreme Lord, the complete whole, so everything belongs to him. Even we belong to him. We ourselves, we are his properties. So how can we even think about replacing him? So him being so merciful towards us, he has given us this material nature for us to fulfill our material needs. But what we are doing is that due to our foolishness, we are only destroying everything in the name of development, so-called development. Then when everything gets out of control, we see our so-called supreme rulers, our so-called democratically elected rulers, they are telling us that we should grow our own vegetables to cope with rising food prices. So it in relation to this mantra, it is stated that the Lord has provided everything for the entire creation. So we should only take what is our quota and not beyond that. The Lord is in chapter 7 of Gita. There are descriptions in verse 7.4 and beyond that regarding the Lord's different forms of the Supreme Lord's energies. Like 7.4 talks about the inferior energy of the Supreme Lord, the material energies, and also the Lord also talks about the distinction between the three types of energies, like the inferior material energy, the superior spiritual energy, and also the marginal energy, which consists of us as the conditioned living entities. So all these emanate from the Supreme Lord. So even the material energy emanates from him, and therefore he is not subject to this material energy. Only we, as the conditioned living entities, we are like trapped in between the Lord's superior spiritual energy and also his inferior material energy. So we, as conditioned living entities, we are subject to the material energy, but it is not the case with the Supreme Lord, who himself is the source of this material energy. So that is the basic distinction between ourselves and the Supreme Lord. He is the proprietor of everything. So how can we even think about replacing him or taking over his position? And in Gita's chapter 7, after this series of verses, starting from 7.4, there are descriptions about all these, the material energy and the spiritual energy. And up to 7.14. In 7.14, Krishna says how the influence of the material energy is very strong in this material world. But Krishna says that those who surrender to him can cross over this ocean of material existence. So this is also often equated to this analogy of how, let's say, if we go to visit someone at their residence, and if that person has a pet dog or a fierce watchdog, so if it's a very fierce dog, whenever we go to their house, the dog will be barking at us, and the if the dog is very fierce, it might even come to attack us. But if the owner of the dog knows us, and if we are close to him, then that person can easily tame the dog. So similarly, this material energy is also very similar to this fierce dog. But if we surrender to the owner or the source of this material energy, then we can easily cross over this ocean of material existence. That's what Krishna says in Gita 7.14. So since Krishna is the source of all these different energies, like the spiritual, material, and also marginal energy, so he is the only one who knows how to utilize all these energies, and therefore he has created all the natural resources like the rivers, hills, and mountains for us to use, not to abuse. But what we are doing is that since we have this delusion and we tend to be greater than God, so what we do is that we end up messing up everything. Whatever Krishna gave us as these beautiful natural resources for us to use for our basic needs, we are abusing everything and we are messing up everything. The most relevant example related to this mess that we have created is this so-called climate change. Actually, there is no climate change. We are the ones who messed up everything, and no matter how hard we try, things continue to get messed up because the same people who put up hoardings to say that we are aiming to plant millions of trees, they are the ones who also cut all the existing trees. They cut down all the existing trees, and then they put up so many hoardings saying that we are aiming to plant millions of trees by this in the next few years or something, all sorts of nonsense. So that's how we are abusing all these natural resources that are part of Krishna's material energy. Krishna being the source of the material energy, only he knows how to utilize it. So he transforms his material energy into so many different forms for us to use. If we look at the 84 lakh living entities, it is stated in Vishnu Puran regarding these 84 lakh living entities. Jalaja Nava Lakshani, Stavaram Lakshavimshati, Krimiyo Rutra Sankhya, Pakshinam Dasa Lakshanam, Trimsha Lakshani Pasava, Chatur Lakshani Manusha. Jalaja Nava Lakshani, meaning 9 lakh aquatics. Stavaram Lakshavimshati, plants and non-moving entities, 20 lakhs. Krimyo Rudra Sankhyaha, germs and insects, 11 lakh. Pakshinam Dasa Lakshanam, bird species, 10 lakhs. Trimsal Lakshani Pasavaha, 4 lakh animals, 30 lakhs. Chatur Lakshani Manushaha, 4 lakh human beings, human species. So that's how we get these 84 lakh species. So even the non-moving entities like trees and mountains are also part of these 84 lakh species. So whatever that has been created from Krishna's material energy, only he knows how to get the most out of them. So he created all these for us to use and not abuse, but we are only abusing to create so-called development, and ultimately we only end up creating more and more mess. So this is simply due to our ignorance, where we fail to understand the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord. Only if we understand the supreme proprietorship as explained in Ishopanishad, in these Ishopanishad mantras, as we saw in the invocation mantra and also this first mantra, only then we can acknowledge, if we understand the supreme proprietorship, then we can acknowledge that all these beautiful resources were created by the Supreme Lord. So whatever inventions that we come up with, they all require raw materials and some ingredients for us to work with, the inputs. Even these inputs come from natural resources. So despite our ability to convert these inputs into outputs called inventions, we still have to acknowledge the fact that even those raw inputs came from the Supreme Lord. But it is due to our false ego that we are unable to understand that. And if we have this tendency to identify ourselves as a so-called intellectual, then we tend to completely deny the existence of the Supreme Lord. So regarding that, Krishna himself has mentioned in the Gita in 7.13. In Gita 7.13, Krishna says, deluded by the three modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance, the whole world does not know me, who am above the modes and inexhaustible. Mohitam na vijanati. So the so-called rationalists, atheists, and half-baked intellectuals who deny the existence of the Supreme Lord, they are doing that because of this delusion, which is also mentioned by Krishna himself, because according to Krishna in Gita 7.13, such people are under delusion created by these three modes of material nature. But Krishna himself is above these modes because these modes are mere byproducts which arise out of his material energy. Regarding our so-called inventions and discoveries, we can clearly see that whatever groundbreaking technologies that we come up with, we somehow we tend to call it artificial XYZ. We use terms like artificial intelligence, artificial this, artificial that. So when we use the term artificial itself, it is a tacit admission. We are tacitly admitting that it is part of material nature, but material nature itself is part of the inferior energy of the Supreme Lord. So whenever these scientists come up with something and they call it artificial this, artificial that, they are tacitly admitting the supreme proprietorship, but due to their false ego and foolishness, they do not give credit where it's due. And therefore, this so-called concept of atheism and godlessness prevails in the society, and we will always end up in a greater mess due to our failure to understand this supreme proprietorship. As stated by the Supreme Lord in 7.14, Gita 7.14, only those who surrender to him can be delivered from this illusion and delusion which arises from the three modes of material nature. So the so-called rationalists and atheists who deny the existence of the Supreme Lord will always remain in such conditions. Of course, Krishna himself goes on to say in Gita 7.15 that there are these four types of people who never surrender to him. But we also know, as mentioned earlier, we also know that there are the other four types of people who surrender to Krishna. And Krishna also mentions that they are dearmost to him. Apart from us as living entities in this Earth planet, even in the upper world, there are many more exalted devotees like Lord Brahma himself. He is the perfect example who understands this concept of supreme proprietorship. The essence of Isha Upanishad is that we as living entities who are parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, we should work according to the Supreme Lord's desire by using the resources provided by the Supreme Lord. So Lord Brahma is a perfect example who demonstrates how we should work according to this Ishavasya principle, which is the essence of Ishopanishad. Lord Brahma is one who completely understands supreme proprietorship because, as we have seen in some of our Friday sessions, in Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 5, in the conversation between Brahma and Narada Muni, Brahma is admitting to Narada Muni that he merely creates what has been discovered by the Supreme Lord. Though Brahma is well known to be the one who excels in the task of creation, he himself has the humility to acknowledge the fact that he only creates what has been already discovered or created by the Supreme Lord. So even in the third canto, this is also something which we have seen in some of our Friday sessions. So in the third canto also, it is mentioned that there are two types of creation, like creation and sub-creation. Actually, there are 9 forms of creation. They are divided into creation and sub-creation, like the primary and secondary types of creation. So out of these 9 forms of creation, this is mentioned in the third canto, out of these 9 forms of creation, the first 6 forms are the ones that are created by the Supreme Lord himself. Like Lord Brahma himself was created by the Supreme Lord. So that itself is like the primary creation. And then the remaining 3 types of the secondary creation, those are the things which are created by Lord Brahma. So despite the fact that Lord Brahma is often known to be the icon of creation, he is known to be the source of creation, but he himself has the humility to admit that he is doing all this with the mercy of the Supreme Lord. He remains humble because he understands this concept of supreme proprietorship. He knows who is the supreme controller, and therefore he is not obsessed by trying to project himself as the supreme controller or something. Unlike Hiranyakashipu and Ravana, these demoniac personalities who got the boons from Brahma and Shiva, they were so foolish to the point where they could not realize the fact that the ones who were giving them the boons were themselves exalted devotees of the Supreme Lord. So such is our foolishness in this age of Kali, and therefore our failure to understand the supreme proprietorship, as mentioned in Ishopanishad, that is the root cause of why we are seeing the exact opposite of what happened in Dwapara Yuga. In Dwapara Yuga, all the natural resources were also in harmony during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira, and they were paying their quota of the taxes as taxes to the king. But what we are seeing nowadays is the exact opposite, because we ourselves are destroying all the natural resources in the name of development due to our failure to understand this concept of supreme proprietorship. We fail to understand who is the supreme proprietor, so we end up destroying all the beautiful natural resources that were created by the supreme proprietor for our own benefits. So as long as we remain in this deluded condition, no form of ism, whether it's communism or capitalism, no form of ism can save us. Because even if we look at the so-called ideology of communism, which claims to work for the welfare of everyone, ultimately, even in such ideologies, the concentration of power ends up at the hands of only a few people, or at the hands of a dictator. So none of these isms can save us. Only the Ishavasya principle, if we are able to understand the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, only then we can get ourselves out of this mess that we ourselves have created. So it is also mentioned in the purport for the first mantra of Ishopanishad that the root of sin is deliberate disobedience to the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. So all this mess that we are seeing nowadays is because we it's not just we fail to understand the proprietorship of the Lord, we also tend to deny the existence of the Supreme Lord. Disobeying the laws of nature or the order of the Lord brings ruin to a human being. Conversely, one who is sober, who knows the laws of nature, and who is not influenced by unnecessary attachment or aversion, is sure to be recognized by the Lord and thus become eligible to go back to Godhead, back to the eternal home. So the Ishavasya principle mentioned in this Ishopanishad is the essence that was practiced by the great kings like Maharaj Yudhishthira, because they were always aware of the fact that they are only serving as an agent of the Supreme Lord. They are only serving as the representative of the Supreme Lord. That attribute is completely lacking in this modern age. So as long as this Ishavasya principle is not practiced by everyone, regardless of whether we are involved in the business of administration or not, we all have to practice this Ishavasya principle of respecting the Supreme Lord's creations, especially the natural resources, so that we only take what is our rightful quota only for our basic needs. Only then we will not end up messing up all the abundant natural resources. Though now it may seem to be like too late, but it's never too late. So let's just try to practice this Ishavasya principle, because that is the only way we can be in harmony with nature. As mentioned earlier, the three forms of conflicts happen between man and man, man and animal, and man and nature. So this conflict between man and nature is what is going to be extremely disastrous for us. So unless we respect the creations of the Supreme Lord, unless we value and appreciate what has been given by the Supreme Lord to us to fulfill our basic needs, and unless we continue to maintain these resources according to the Ishavasya principle mentioned in Ishopanishad, we can never get ourselves out of this mess. So the remainder of the purport of this verse, the control of the Lord is everywhere, and if the Lord is pleased, every part of nature will be pleased. The river will flow profusely to fertilize the land. The oceans will supply sufficient quantities of minerals, pearls, and jewels. The forest will supply sufficient wood, drugs, and vegetables, and the seasonal changes will effectively help produce fruits and flowers in profuse quantity. So this is what we should do. We should do everything to please the Supreme Lord, so that even the creations of the Supreme Lord will be in harmony with our existence, to create the ideal situation for us to lead our lives. But what we are seeing nowadays is that those who cut down all the trees, all the existing trees, then they put up hoardings saying that we are aiming to plant millions of trees over the next few years. So such foolishness is the complete opposite of what is advocated by the Ishavasya principle. The artificial way of living depending on factories and tools can render so-called happiness only to a limited number at the cost of millions. Since the energy of the mass of people is engaged in factory production, the natural products are being hampered, and for this, the mass is unhappy. Without being educated properly, the mass of people are following in the footsteps of the vested interests by exploiting natural reserves and therefore there's acute competition between individual and nation. So that is why this age of quarrel and hypocrisy is only getting further and further degraded due to our greed and our foolishness, our failure to understand the Ishavasya principle of supreme proprietorship. There's no control by the trained agent of the Lord. We must look into the defects of modern civilization by comparison here and should follow in the footsteps of Maharaj Yudhishthira to cleanse man and wipe out anachronisms. So that's all for this verse. So it talks about, basically it talks about how even the natural resources were in complete harmony during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira, since the Supreme Lord himself was very pleased of his devotee being the ruler. But as we saw in many of the earlier verses of this chapter, whatever we are seeing nowadays is the exact opposite. So, but it's never too late, even at the individual level. If we practice the Ishavasya principle of appreciating whatever has been provided by the Supreme Lord for our basic needs, even if we practice in our daily lives at an individual level, even to like save water in electricity, for example, even if we have that, even if we practice such basics of the Ishavasya principle at an individual level, then we can still please the Supreme Lord to a certain extent. But ultimately, it also depends on how much those who are at the much higher positions, even they should realize this principle of supreme proprietorship. But still, we all can do our share to prevent further damage. So that's all for this verse for today's session. Any questions or comments?
No, Prabhu.
Yeah, okay.
Very nice.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for attending. We'll meet again next week. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu.